There's two big issues here when it comes to Farage and reforms finance. The first big one is this £5 million gift from Christopher Harborne. So Christopher Harborne was a minor Tory donor, he was very pro-Brexit. Then in 2019, when Farage set up the Brexit Party, the first major donation he gets is from this guy, Christopher Harborne. Christopher Harborne is a Thailand-based investor. He owns a big chunk of Tether, which is a stablecoin cryptocurrency, very controversial cryptocurrency. And he also was a lot of aviation, other interests. So this guy starts giving the Brexit Party money. And then he gives about £10 million to the Brexit Party in 2019 under Nigel Farage. That's a huge chunk of money, right? So he's a big donor to the Brexit Party when Nigel Farage sets it up. Nigel Farage then steps down from running the Brexit Party. He owns the party at the time. It's a limited company. He owns it. Richard Tice becomes his number two, becomes the leader of the Brexit Party. So the reason I'm telling you all this is it's the chronology. What happens then is in 2024, before the 2024 general election, and crucially before Farage has announced he's going to stand. If people cast their minds back, it wasn't clear. Farage was saying, will he, won't he, might and he mightn't. Before he stands, Christopher Harborne gives him £5 million. So he gives him this chunk of money. It doesn't go to reform the party, it goes to Farage himself.
And he gives it to him in crypto, right?
No, he gives it to him.
No.
It's a cash.
Okay.
The reason is because almost nobody uses crypto. Crypto has no use value. You can't really if you give people £5 million in crypto, they can't really use it. No, as far as I'm aware, it's a cash donation. It's money into Farage's bank account. He gives him this £5 million. Farage crucially doesn't declare this. So Farage doesn't declare it. It's revealed by the Guardian a few months ago ahead of the local elections. So what Farage is saying is, I didn't have to declare this because it was a personal gift. So under the rules, the parliamentary rules, which I've actually written about in the past, because I'm a sad person who looks at who has to declare what after they get elected. In the 12 months before you become elected, and this is actually an issue that Transparency International I've done work on before. So there's a bit of a grey area about people giving you money before you become a candidate and before you're elected. So in the 12 months before you're elected, if you become an MP, you're supposed to declare any gift over £300 that could be perceived, keyword perceived, to be to do with politics. So Farage says this £5 million has nothing to do with politics. It was a personal gift. I've given it because of the work I've done on Brexit. Most people would say that is quite political. But crucially, I think with this is that it's a huge chunk of money. And at the time, Farage isn't the party leader, but he's the chairman of the party and he owns the company that is the party. So Farage is saying, I've done nothing wrong. I'm going to go to the electorate rather than have this transparency investigation by the parliamentary standards. So parliamentary standards is looking at this. So this £5 million is really significant because Harborne as well has now gone on to give Reform, I think, about £12 million since then. He is by far and away Reform's biggest donor. He's given them huge amounts of money for British politics. And Farage's argument is this £5 million direct to him was nothing to do with politics. It was a completely separate thing. So that's a big chunk of Farage's money problems, because most people go, well, they don't have someone giving them £5 million. And Farage is arguing he did nothing wrong, and this is why the by-elections happen.
Quick question, Peter.
Yeah.
And £5 million itself is a big amount in British politics too, right? It's a
really huge amount of money. Yeah, like if you back say 10 years ago, like if you look say to the Brexit referendum itself, the spending limits in the Brexit referendum for the Leave side and the Remain side, I think they were just over £10 million. So this is what they could spend in total during the entire campaign. Harborne's giving us one chunk of cash to Farage. The size of Harborne's donations are, he is now the biggest funder in the history of British politics. So no, these are really big chunks of money. And so that's the big issue. One of the big issues that Farage is facing, and in some ways it's the easiest issue to see because it's £5 million, and he says there's nothing wrong here. And I think, a lot of people would struggle to interpret those rules I mentioned of £300 and say that this £5 million wasn't something that most right-thinking people would think would have an influence. The other bit since that donation, since that big chunk of cash came out, was we now know that this guy called George Cottrell, Posh George, who's been part of Farage's entourage for a very long time, and I and others have written about him for quite a long time. He's a convicted fraudster, convicted in the US, spent time in prison in the US. The Sunday Times recently revealed that George Cottrell, again ahead of the 2024 general election, at this moment where we couldn't really see what Farage is doing, Cottrell was paying for people to work for Farage, to do things like social media, to do other things that are quite political, quite clearly political. These people have been hired and working for Farage. And if people cast back, around that time, from 2024 onwards, Farage has become the kind of social media politician du jour. He really wasn't before that, but now he's Mr. TikTok. That didn't happen because Farage suddenly got good at vertical video. It came because he had really good people working for him. And those people, we now know, at least some of them, were being paid by George Cottrell. So two big questions that. One is that wasn't declared either. And the second is, where did this money from Cottrell come from? Because Cottrell is a convicted fraudster. He spends most of his time in Montenegro. He's got a lot of colourful business characters. So there's a whole question there. And there's a kicker, there's actually a third part of this story, which is that it now emerges that, and I wrote about this a lot, for a long time, the Reform Party, a lot of their money was actually coming from Richard Tice, the now deputy leader, through companies he controlled or loans from his businesses to the company. It now emerges that at least one of his companies that made a donation to Reform, they were given £500,000 by Fiona Cottrell, George Cottrell's mum. So George Cottrell's mum gives Tice's company £500,000, which is then given to Reform. That money is not recorded as from George Cottrell's mum; it's recorded as coming from Tice's company. So that's an issue in British electoral law, frankly. The police are looking into it at the moment about where that £500,000 has come from. Like, what's its progeny? Did it come from Cottrell's mum or did it come from another source? But also in terms of electoral law, there's a problem because you're not allowed to use. You can't. Tice's defence is that Fiona Cottrell is a British voter, so there's nothing to see here. But in that case, she should have just given the money herself. It shouldn't have come through a pass-through vehicle. It all sounds slightly complicated, but the big top line is you're talking about three stories that are divergent but connected that all raise serious concerns about Reform's funding. And a fourth is that Robert Jenrick, who recently came to Reform from the Tories, he's also been investigated. Well, the police are investigating a donation that came to him as part of his Tory leadership campaign that they're worried about that might have it also came from the US, from a guy who has now been convicted of fraud himself as well. Jenrick said, I knew nothing about that, but the police are investigating that. So this is quite a lot.
And but when Farage announced he was quitting his seat, he claimed he was being basically the victim of a kind of political witch hunt. He said the people of Clacton should be the judges of my actions. And like you mentioned, there's an ongoing investigation by the Parliament Standards Commissioner into that £5 million gift, for example. If Farage wins the by-election in Clacton, does any of this actually go away? The investigation continues.
No, none of this goes away. This is a big part of this, and I do wonder if Farage was poorly briefed on electoral law and on parliamentary standards, because it doesn't work like this. So if he wins, as it looks very likely in Clacton, the Standards Commission investigation will reopen. And actually, even if he loses, the Standards Commission investigation will reopen. So that's what happened to Owen Paterson. If people cast their mind back, Owen Paterson was a Tory MP who in some ways actually I think was the downfall of Boris Johnson started with Owen Paterson. If you remember, Owen Paterson was the Standards Commission, there was an investigation into Owen Paterson that found that he had taken money to lobby on behalf of companies, and there was Boris Johnson attempted basically to pull apart the Independent Standards Commission to keep Owen Paterson in post because there was a triggered a by-election. But subsequently there was a full report into Owen Paterson, even though he actually then stood down and and the Tories lost the by-election. There was a full report because these processes do actually go on even if you lose. What Reform would do in this context, Robert Jenrick, I think 24 hours out from Farage announcing this, said, or 24 hours afterwards, said, we'll just keep on running by-elections to stop the standards process. I don't think that's feasible. I don't think we can have an endless by-election in Clacton. So I don't think it's going to work. So there's every chance that voters of Clacton will have yet another chance to vote on Nigel Farage in a few months' time. Reform are massively bankrolled by people with cryptocurrency investments, cryptocurrency interests, a lot of money in crypto. And one of the areas where Reform has got really detailed, thought out policies on cryptocurrency. They want to deregulate it, they want to reduce taxes on it, they want Britain to become what they call a world leader in it. It's really striking, and they didn't seem that interested in this before they started taking all this money. So it does feel like as a lay person, you can say, well, it's striking that Reform's really interested in crypto. Now these people are giving them money. So in some ways, I think it's sui generis. But this, in another way, it isn't. In another way, this is an inevitable symptom of a political system that runs on unlimited amounts of private funding. So in Britain, we don't have a cap on political donations. You can give as much money as you want. There's now £100,000 cap on Britain's overseas. People like Harborne, which the government brought in a couple of months ago. But in general, people can give as much money as they want. And for a long time, people kind of gave smaller amounts of money. Really, they gave our politics has scandals to do with money for years. I was writing about Neil Hamilton last week, ahead of the Clacton by-election. If people remember the Cash for Question scandals of the 90s, so they're in some ways they're not new. But I was talking to a senior political correspondent the other day who reported on all of them, and he was like, yes, it's not new. We've had these problems before, but the scale is just so much worse. And the amount of money, something we document in Democracy for Sale, is just the amount of money in our system. And it has gone up and up so much. There was an incredible statistic that Transparency International brought out recently that found that I think it was in 2023, 2/3 of all the funding for political parties, something like 60 million, came from just 19 rich individuals. So, this is, it's the concentration of wealth in our society is also happening in our politics. So the small number of super rich individuals, and Reform are in some ways the inevitable end point of that, where I did a story, which I'm sure I could update now, but I found that 75% of Reform's funding had come from just 3 people. So what you're talking about is a super concentration of a very small number of donors. There's always been an element to which giving money is a very much a minority concern. Most people do not give money, even most rich people don't. But now what we're seeing is a very, very small number of often super wealthy people are bankrolling British politics.
And as Imaan said, obviously you've been looking at this story for years. You've got your brilliant newsletter, Democracy for Sale, that's really, really following this story very closely. And you've also been looking specifically at Reform's funding for a long time. You wrote last year about sort of the black hole in Reform's funding when it kind of transitions from Brexit Party to Reform. Can you talk a little bit about what you found? What is this black hole in its funding?
Yes, and I can tell you what's happened since then too. So basically, I've always been interested in reading company accounts published by political parties because I'm a sad.
Each to their own, Peter.
Each to their own. They keep me up. I think I've been on holidays reading company accounts on PDFs. I've got a problem, guys.
We know what to get you for Christmas.
Yeah,
Very
exactly.
non-expensive book. Anyway.
But what was interesting, so if you cast back, I mentioned it, a Brexit Party. So Brexit Party starts in 2019. Had some funding from Christopher Harborne and a few other people. In the middle of 2019, there's an European elections. And if people remember, the Tory parties finished 4th. It was their worst ever performance. They polled less than 10%. And Theresa May was replaced by Boris Johnson, and we had the 2019 general election. Ahead of the 2019 general election, Reform did something very striking. They stood down in all Tory-held seats. So they went into the general election effectively saying, we're not really running here. And they had very little chance of winning any seats then. What I was always interested in was how much money Reform raised and spent in 2019, especially during the 2019 general election. They took in well over £10 million during the general election campaign, almost all of which came after they'd said they weren't going to stand in the election. That's quite a curious thing to do. It's quite weird for people to give money to a political party that's not standing for election, really. Almost all that money came from Christopher Harborne. So they got this huge amount of money. And I've always been interested in that, and I wrote about this black hole. And effectively, how Reform declare their accounts, they give less information on other political parties. So other political parties give you a breakdown of different costs. And what's quite striking is even within that, they do give you staffing costs, which all other parties do too. And what's really striking is most parties spend almost all their money on staff, unsurprisingly. And they've got another category called other, which is like kind of other odds and sods, which is normally about 3, 4, 5%. In 2019, Reform's other spending was about 40-something%, which means it's really hard to say how they spent this money. But by the end of 2019, they're completely bankrupt. They sack all of their staff. And by the start of 2020, they're reliant on loans, soft loans, from Richard Tice. So that's quite an odd journey. I'm like, well, that's really interesting. And actually, a couple of months ago, I think after the 5 million, Ben Habib, who was a Brexit Party MEP, who was in Reform, who fell out with Farage, he claimed in an interview that the money came from Christopher Harborne, basically to get Nigel Farage to stand down. that was the kind of deal, that there was a deal done here. I can't prove that, but that's what Habib has said. But what's really striking, I think, what my reporting has found, and if you talk to other people in the space, it's completely unprecedented. That experts look at this and go, this makes absolutely no sense. They've never seen this in a political party. The political party raises tons of money, having said that they're not going to campaign. It's a very odd thing. Because if you fast forward to 2024, when the Brexit Party or the Reform Party really are definitely campaigning in the 2024 general election, Farage is back. They're definitely campaigning. They raised 4.25 million ahead of the 2024 general election. So they raised an order of magnitude more to campaign an election they weren't fighting in, to one where they were an insurgent party. They won 5 seats. They could have won more. And Christopher Harborne, we now know, gave £5 million to Farage as this gift that was undeclared ahead of that election campaign too.
So what exactly is the black hole then in the funding?
I think the black hole in the accounts is what was done with all this money.
It's the 40% other.
Yeah, where did all that money go? Where did all Christopher Harborne's money go? How did the political party that wasn't running in a campaign burn through over £10 million in 6 weeks and then need to be dependent on loans by the start of next year? I don't know the answer to that question. If anybody does, they can write in and tell me.
You've been watching an interview from the Prospect podcast. To listen to this episode in full, click the link in the description below. And to read or listen to more of Prospect's journalism, visit prospectmagazine.co.uk.